Welcome into another edition of Inside Carolina's Next Level, where Greg Barnes and myself get together, talk a little deeper than the normal podcast we do at Inside Carolina. And with a football game coming up against Minnesota, North Carolina fans are not very familiar. We've heard a lot of talk about the Big Ten and conference realignment, but North Carolina fans not very familiar with Minnesota. So Greg has procured a special guest that will help us understand the Golden Gophers a little bit better.
Well, if anybody's on the message board, I've been around for a long time, and one thing I hadn't even thought about doing, and because I guess there's a lack of trust in just fans in general, maybe. But I looked the other day, and there's a Minnesota at North Carolina joint 247 thread, and I'm like, oh goodness, this could go really bad. And Ryan Burns, who works at the 247 Minnesota site, set it up, and it is phenomenal. I've been incredibly impressed. It's Carolina fans and Minnesota fans going back and forth, sharing information, poking and prodding a little bit. But it's been a fun read, and I said, man, that's a really good idea. We need some insight on Minnesota. As we talked off air. Carolina fans don't know a lot about Minnesota, whether it be the state or the actual team, because these programs have never faced. And so, Ryan, I want to welcome you aboard. Thanks for joining us.
I appreciate you guys having me. Yeah, I'd imagine most Carolina folks think Minnesota's a cold, barren wasteland 365 days a year, considering when I talk to recruits, I would say, from the South, I would say that's what they think. I'm staring outside right now. It's 75 degrees. We had as many 90-degree days, including last week, as we've ever had. I mean, it does get green and warm up here, and now it does snow. I ain't going to hide from that. But, yeah, I mean, it's nice out here. And that joint thread, again, we've done that before with other Minnesota opponents, ones that I know there's not a lot of animosity between. And to your point, I don't know that Minnesota fans know a lot about North Carolina, and North Carolina fans don't know a lot about Minnesota. So that's where I thought to myself, I'm going to text Ben and see if he's open to it. And I think it's gone as well as I hoped it would. I know there's going to be a large contingent of Minnesota fans traveling down. I just talked with some folks over at the University of Minnesota today. I think they're expecting somewhere around 7,500 to potentially a little bit more than that to travel down to Chapel Hill. So there's a lot of people that are excited to see what it looks like between Minnesota and North Carolina.
So first question here, and I'm going to give you a few of these easy ones to start off with, just to kind of give North Carolina fans some understanding. In the ACC, there are a lot of very small schools. Undergrad-wise, Carolina, Tommy, you can correct me here, I think still below 20,000. Wake Forest is like 6,000. Duke's about the same. Boston College, of course, is small. In the Big Ten, however, there's a lot of big alumni bases and enrollments. How many students, undergrads, are at Minnesota?
Oh, that's a great question. I know it's north of, I graduated from the University of Minnesota. I would imagine undergrad, probably 30,000 at least. It might be a little bit more than that. I mean, it's a very big campus. There's a lot of people that come in and commute as well. But the alumni base, especially for these Big Ten schools, I mean, you mentioned the Michigans and the Ohio States of the world is massive. Now, Minnesota has a giant alumni base. It's a very big campus. But, yeah, I guess I hadn't even thought about that. Yeah, Minnesota's enrollment, I would say, is pretty big compared to some of these ACC schools.
For sure. Just in the state of North Carolina, and granted, we have a lot of FBS level schools, but I think State and maybe UNC Charlotte now are probably the only ones right around 30, if above that. Speaking of the weather, North Carolina fans, I've already talked to a number of them, are looking forward to coming up to Minnesota for reasons we've already discussed next year.
Yep.
And that game's going to be in September. So they don't need to bring their parkas. Is that what you're telling us?
No. I mean, for the opening game against Nebraska, I think that day was 89 degrees. I think that weekend it got up to 99 and 101. But I believe this game is going to be played in and around Labor Day next year, if I'm right.
Yep.
Which, if Carolina fans remember this about 11 months from now, the Minnesota State Fair is going to be going on during that time. And it's one of the biggest events that people travel to. I mean, it's everything you can imagine on a stick. It is, I hope you go there very hungry, because I can assure you, you won't leave hungry. But it's the Great Minnesota Get Together is what it's called. So if you come up a couple days early, the State Fair will be going on. Give it a check. But yeah, it's going to be warm. I can assure you it'll be above 80 degrees more than likely.
Yeah, and Tommy, we've had so many days of late where it's pushing 100, then you add in the humidity, it's just kind of miserable. So when you say 89, it's like, all right, well that's pretty typical for around here. So
and food and anything you can get on a stick too.
I'm telling you, there's always brand new foods coming out. I know there was a bunch of different pickle variations of different stuff like that. But I'm telling you, anything you can ever imagine on a stick, deep fried and just covered in calories is the way I'm going to say it. I mean, you're going to do a lot of walking while you're there, trying to offset some of the calories, but you'll get a nice cold beverage in your hand, go eat some nice deep fried food, and get to see what Minnesota's about.
And Tommy, while North Carolina and Minnesota have never played, there are some familiar ties, and I'll just run through these real quick to see if anybody can kind of pick up on these. But John Gutekunst was the head coach at Minnesota back in the late 80s. He was also defensive coordinator for John Bunning for, I guess, 3 years, the last 3 years that John was in Chapel Hill. Everybody knows and loves Tim Brewster. He was head coach at Minnesota.
Yeah.
And he had a good run in Chapel Hill back in the 1990s, and then had a fun exit a few years ago. Where's he at? I don't even know where he's at.
He's
now.
at Colorado.
Coach Prime out there in Colorado. I'll tell you, Tim Brewster, not beloved here. I think he has blocked the entire state of Minnesota on the Twitter machine at this point. One of the biggest dumpster fires I can remember was the hire of Tim Brewster back 15 years ago now.
Yep. Carolina fans, there's bonding. That's what we're here.
Oh, yeah. There it is.
That's why the thread on the message board is somewhat peaceful, because
blocked by Brew. We're all rooting for it.
And I'll throw one more out there, Tommy. This is about PJ Fleck, who's a Midwest guy through and through. And when Dave Doran was the head coach at Northern Illinois before he went to NC State, he hired PJ Fleck as offensive coordinator. And the very next day, PJ left. He resigned, and I think went to Tampa Bay, if I remember that correctly. So Carolina fans will probably get a kick out of that as well.
Well, and also you've got Chris Collins, transferred from North Carolina, that plays for Minnesota.
You'll see him back on the field at Chapel Hill. He'll probably be playing 15 to 20 snaps as a backup rush end type, the stand-up end in Minnesota's defense. But he'll be back trying to get a little vengeance on Mack Brown and staff.
That'll be interesting. One of the coaches today, is his former position coach, said, wish him well, hope he does well, hope we run over him repeatedly on Saturday afternoon. Yep. Ryan, let me ask you a question about PJ Fleck. I know when North Carolina had coach openings, Fleck's name would come up once in a while, as it has all over the country, but just sort of give us some insight into him. And we talked briefly off the air about the row the boat slogan or mantra. Sort of give us the backstory on that so folks can understand Coach Fleck a little better.
Yeah, we'll start there. I mean, I would say that as someone who's had likely more interactions with him, both with the camera on, the camera off, as anybody in the media world, the way I like to describe PJ Fleck is he's not just one Red Bull, he's 5 Red Bulls all the time. And you're going to know within 15 seconds of meeting the man whether you're going to love that or whether you're going to hate that, and it's off-putting to you. And that's where he does have a lot of slogans. He does have a lot of things like that around the facilities, and he says them in the media. But I think people forget that the most famous one, row the boat, which is something he says to end every press conference, it's around the facilities, is actually tailored around the fact that he lost a child back when he was a little bit younger in those Western Michigan days, I believe. And it's tailored around just keep moving forward. You know, he always talks about put your oar in the water and just keep going forward. And that's essentially what Row the Boat's about. I just think that I'm glad you asked about it, because it's one of the things you always see on social media or other opposing message boards is mocking. I mean, again, he is certainly a character. I mean, he is who he is. He's not going to run from it. But that's where when people row the boat, it's kind of, I feel like people don't do the deep dive and know it's because he lost, a child. when they were, very young, and it's about him trying to work through it. And he tried to share that story with everybody else. But he's someone that has a ton of energy. You're going to see it in between quarters, where I believe during the end of the first and the end of the third, he runs down the field with the team to switch sides. I mean, it is who he is. I mean, when he was initially hired, there was a lot of comparisons with their personalities between him and Tim Brewster. Well, PJ Fleck, while it may be very outgoing, has a lot of energy. You don't luck your way into winning 9 straight games in the last 3 full seasons, or winning 9 or more games, I should say. They're a very disciplined football team. That's one of the things he stresses, but he is a very good football coach.
Let me ask you about that discipline and that football team. And this is another one of those things, and I don't want to call it stereotype because it's not that, but everybody assumes Big Ten football is a certain way. And Minnesota definitely likes to play that way, but just sort of describe the style that this team plays before we get into the details a little bit. Because when I hear Big Ten football, I think, monster offensive linemen, 3 yards in a cloud of dust, that type aspect of it. I remember several years ago when Minnesota was the hot thing there for a while, it didn't seem like that watching it. But you're on the inside. Tell us about the program. Tell us about how it's run and what North Carolina fans can expect to see football-wise on Saturday.
Yeah, you're probably thinking back to that 2019 team that won 11 games, beat Auburn in the Outback Bowl. Certainly a much different team then than they are now. But when I talk about in terms of discipline, you look at year after year after year, PJ Fleck teams are one of the least penalized teams in college football. The ones that usually don't make pre-snap mistakes, don't get the false starts, the offsides, the hand placement on tackles. You're not getting horse collars or face masks. But they're also one of the best in terms of why has Minnesota been so successful in winning football games. It's been on defense. They haven't allowed more than 20 points in any of their last 8 games. How do you do that? You stop the run and you limit explosive plays. I mean, that's been a hallmark of a Minnesota defensive coordinator, Joe Rossi defense, is they don't allow big plays. They're one of the I think if you look at the last few years since he has taken over, they're probably top 15 in football at limiting explosive plays. And their belief there is if you have to make an opposing college football offense drive 10, 12, 14, 16 plays, they're eventually going to make a mistake that's going to prevent them from going into the end zone. Whether that means they have to settle for a field goal, whether you're able to force a turnover, but it's those 4-play 75-yard drives that kill you at the end of the game. And I think Minnesota has seen that in some of their recent losses over the last few seasons. Is why have they lost? They gave up explosive plays. Offensively, I would agree that they historically, last year's team was 3 yards in a cloud of dust. They ran the ball more than anybody else in Power 5 football last season. And they had an all-world running back, Muhammad Ibrahim, one of the best in the country in yards after contact, missed tackles forced. But this offense is a little different. And when you look at just last week's game, I know the stats don't look very, very kind, but that's where Fleck has talked about all week. And we talked with the offensive coordinator, Greg Harbaugh, who is a Raleigh native, someone I know this game means a lot to coming up here on Saturday, is they wanted to make a point where in game 1, they passed the ball to win. It's the way they had to win. This past week against a Mack team that is expected to make a bowl game, but, I mean, they're okay. They decided we got to be more physical up front and show North Carolina that we can beat them through the air, beat them on the ground. So I do think you're not going to see Minnesota throw the ball only 15 times like they did last week. I would imagine that's likely going to be doubled, if not in the 30 to 35 range. They are big up front. I mean, we're talking about boys that are all 6'5", 300 pounds, if not a little bit more. But it all comes down to, for me, it's the discipline on both sides of the ball in terms of don't shoot yourselves in the foot. And more times than not in college football, you're going to give yourself a chance in the fourth quarter to win a football game.
PJ Fleck's been there since 2017, so he's got a little bit of a head start on Mack. But one thing that we talk a lot about with Mack Brown is 2.0, of course, but it's building the program in his image. And this is year 5 for Mack. And when he came in 2019, he sat on the sideline, worked for ESPN, and was just enamored with what Lincoln Riley was doing at Oklahoma. And that was kind of his thing. We're going to have an explosive offense. It's going to be air raid. It's going to be power rushing game. We want to score 50 points a game, and I want Heisman Trophy candidate quarterbacks. So he brings in Phil Longo. And really what we saw through the first 4 years is, North Carolina was really good offensively, but the defense kept getting worse every single year until last year. It was one of the worst in the country and maybe the worst at the Power 5 level. So it's this whole conversation of, okay, well, Mack was all about defense back in the 90s, and the offense was trying to catch up. Now it's, the offense is where it's at, and the defense is trying to catch up. So what is that mentality? What is that identity? And the question's still out with Mack. PJ Fleck, as I said, has been there for a couple of years longer. Is this identity that he wants what he has in terms of an elite defense and then a complementary offense, or is that just kind of where the pieces have him right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's one to where I think it's important to note, first off, that PJ is a Jim Tressel disciple. And what that means in his eyes, and he's talked about it over the years, is they want to be great on defense. They want to be ball control on offense. I think in an ideal world, PJ Fleck in wins is holding the ball for 35 minutes a game, 40 minutes a game at times. They want to be able to limit the opposing offensive possessions. And then you look at specifically in this upcoming game on Saturday, I would agree with him that the short amount of time that Drake May is hopefully on the field, I mean, the more time he's on the field, the more the chance is that Drake May can go be one of the best quarterbacks in college football. And that was stressed again today. But I do think that this team, and especially in year 7 now, is certainly in the identity of what he wants. They want to be able to complement themselves on offense, defense, and special teams. Special teams has been certainly an issue for them all 7 years now. They finally blocked their second punt of the Fleck era last week against Eastern Michigan, but I wouldn't get your hopes up too much there in terms of Minnesota special teams being a game changer. But that's the MO, is they want to be Tressel ball. They want to be able to dominate time of possession. They want to be able to get off the field on third down on defense, which I believe they were number 2 in college football last year with just a couple of NFL draft picks back there. In terms of getting off the field on third down, they've been pretty good at it. They just allowed only 4 yards of total offense in the second half last week to Eastern Michigan. But that's the thing, is they want to get off the field on defense and they want to sit on the ball on offense. Because again, especially against a team like North Carolina, with how talented that entire offense is, the less they're on the field, the less of a chance they have to hurt you.
One name that I think a lot of people associate with Minnesota just in recent years, of course, is Tanner Morgan. Tanner is now trying to make his way at the pro level. But in the wings, and we saw a little bit of him last year, is Ethan Kaliakmanis. Mm-hmm. They call him the Greek Rifle, which is a fantastic nickname. Right. How has he looked thus far? What's kind of the expectations for him, and what kind of impact do you think he maybe can have this weekend?
I mean, he is the straw that is going to stir the drink of this Gopher offense in 2023. You saw glimpses of it here at times during the 6 or 7 games that he has started in his career. Man, he single-handedly essentially went out and beat a Wisconsin team on the road last year, a very big rivalry game for Minnesota, a place in Camp Randall that has historically been a house of horrors for them for largely my entire lifetime. And behind his right arm, they're able to throw for 300 yards against what I think is one of the best defensive coordinators in college football, and Jim Leonard. We'll see where he ends up here in 2024, but he is the most physically gifted quarterback I've covered in my 12 years in a Gopher uniform. Now, the bar to clear for that, I understand, is Tanner Morgan or Mitch Leidner, which, I love those two kids dearly. But what Ethan can do is certainly beat you with his legs at times. I mean, he's not someone that they're going to have design quarterback runs for, but he has been very efficient, I would say, on third down, where if the pocket breaks down around him, he's more than athletic enough to go pick it up with his legs. He's got a great arm attached to him, but it's going to be, there's been a lot of expectations for him internally over the last few years. Since he signed, he was a 4-star quarterback coming out in that COVID class in 2020, but we haven't seen the consistency from him. And that's where you look at the stats this year, and just over the course of his young college career, they don't look that impressive, and I understand that. But that's where, if Minnesota is going to walk away from this game with a victory, I can assure you it's going to be because Ethan Kaliakmanis finally found a way to put it together for 60 minutes like he did in that Wisconsin game. But he is a very talented quarterback. It's just about he's still learning what throws he can make and what throws he can't.
So could you have a joint thread with Wisconsin and Minnesota?
Absolutely. I'll tell you, not a shot. The fan bases, I would tell you, that hate each other dearly on a Minnesota perspective are Wisconsin and Iowa. Wisconsin now, especially since Minnesota's actually had some success there. Iowa's almost apathetic somewhat because Fleck has never beaten Iowa, which has just been truly remarkable, considering if I just gave you the stats of those games, the last two specifically, you would have thought Minnesota won by 7 to 10 points in both. But strange things have happened in those two rivalry games. I'll tell you that much.
We certainly understand fan bases that go at it down here. Darius Taylor, he's the complement to the Greek rifle. I don't know how many times we've had a situation, and certainly not covering North Carolina that I can remember, where you had the top two running backs in the nation the previous week square off the following week, Marion Hampton and Darius Taylor. What's he bring? And as a freshman, how has he progressed to be able to have a game like he had last weekend?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it, especially with Omarion being named, I believe, the Doak Walker running back of the week in college football. And then you have Darius Taylor, who is the Big Ten freshman of the week. With Darius Taylor, I mean, he was a big recruiting get from Minnesota in the last cycle. Someone was a 4-star composite kid from the state of Michigan, someone that Michigan State certainly made, I would say, healthy NIL opportunities available to. And Darius turned that down. Michigan and Jim Harbaugh tried to flip him after they saw his early senior tape. They remained on him until National Signing Day, and he still signed with Minnesota. And the fun part, I would say, with Darius Taylor is it's only his third ever year playing running back. He was a wide receiver for most of his time, started playing running back in his junior season, fully committed to it his senior year, and that's when he really took off. But he is certainly a north-south running back to go with the east-west, which is Sean Tyler, the other running back from Minnesota who ran for over 1,000 yards at Western Michigan each of the last 2 seasons. He is certainly their explosive back, someone that if he does get into that second and third level, you're not going to catch him. But with Darius, the thing that impressed me most last week was his patience. Something that's so incredibly tough to teach to a young running back who the game, is moving at such a faster pace than it did in Michigan high school football compared to what he saw last Saturday night. And that's where his patience was on display. He's still learning a little bit how to play behind his pads and behind his size. He is a bigger running back, 215, 220 pounds, but he is certainly the north-south option for Minnesota in their rushing attack.
Tommy, you mentioned Darius Taylor talking about 6 degrees of separation. Reading through his recruiting story, you did have the Harbaugh situation where Michigan offered and was trying to get him. His position coach at Minnesota, who was recruiting him, left. And he went to Kent State. He's the new head coach at Kent State, which is where Tez Walker, of course, transferred from, and we've been dealing with the NCAA fallout of that. So we can't get away from it, Tommy.
You cannot. I mean, it's like the Kevin Bacon of college football.
Right.
7 degrees of Kevin Bacon and Tez Walker.
So Ryan, the one thing I love about football, and everybody listening to this knows this, is I am a huge defense guy. I think it's a team that plays good defense owns my heart. What is it about Joe Rossi and the scheme that he runs that has made that defense one of the best in the country the last couple of years?
They have been very detail oriented. You talk to Rossi, you talk to any of his players, it's the details that matter. They collectively play 1 through 11 very well together. I mean, if you just line them up and look at who you want coming off the bus first, I would imagine North Carolina's athletes are probably a little better looking than what Minnesota's got going on out there. I mean, that's a testament to how well I think athletically Mack has recruited there at North Carolina. But for Minnesota, it's so much about fit, because with an NIL group in Dinkytown athletes that's certainly still developing, they can't compete in the NIL game with some of the blue bloods out there. So you have to know what you're looking for, and you have to be able to recruit from the high school level up. And I think that's where they've done a really good job. They do have some guys on defense that will be playing on Sundays. They're led by one of the best safeties in the country, and Tyler Nubin, who had a couple of picks on that national televised game to start the season against Nebraska, really changed it for them. He's likely a top 60 overall pick. They got a really good outside corner in Justin Wally. They're hopefully going to be getting their best linebacker back. who has missed the first 2 games with a soft tissue injury, and Cody Lindenberg. And then up front, I mean, that's to me where I think a lot of this game is going to be dictated. I think, again, I'm just the outside perspective. I've only seen on tape what it looks like, but North Carolina's offensive line versus Minnesota's defensive line is going to be the thing I want to see, because I think Minnesota's defensive line has gotten better. Their 22 defensive line was the most underachieving unit in the Fleck era to me, because they have the bodies back there to be impactful. And in game 1, they were impactful on the outside. And in game 2, they were impactful with their defensive tackles. Now, can they merge that all together? That's going to be the question. But why has Joe Rossi been so successful? Schematically, I think he does one of the best jobs in terms of trying to confuse the opposing quarterback into, maybe he thinks it's man, but it's actually zone. Or if it's zone, he thinks it's cover 2 and it's actually cover 4. Throwing different looks at the the quarterback to try and get him off. Now, Drake May is the best quarterback that Joe Rossi, I think, has faced in years. And that's going to be certainly put to the test. As much as this game is North Carolina versus Minnesota, I think the tail of the tape is going to be Drake May versus Joe Rossi. Which one of them has more success about one another, I think, is going to tell a big story in this game.
We're talking with Ryan Burns, 24/7's Minnesota guy, giving us the dish on the Gophers. Ryan, let me ask you a question. You said something that sort of caught my ear. You said the 22 defensive line was the most underachieving group in years. Well, you could say the same thing about North Carolina's. And in the first couple games, similar to what you described for Minnesota, Carolina, 9 sacks, everybody talked about that. And then against App State, they weren't as good. Why do you think Minnesota's group across that defensive front improved or has improved and developed between last year and this year?
I would say the change of defensive line coach played a big part in it. I think Brick Haley, who was the defensive line coach last year, just didn't get enough out of his guys. Now he's no longer with the program. He's now the Purdue defensive line coach with Ryan Walters out there at Purdue. They brought back actually one of the players that played for PJ Fleck at Minnesota in one of his first couple of seasons, by a young man by the name of Winston Delighty-Boudaire, who's one of the youngest Power 5 assistant coaches in college football now. I think he's 23, 24, 25 years old. I mean, he's played with some of the guys that are still here. And I think just a change in perspective has played a part. I also think that a lot of those guys last year were getting their feet wet for the first time, especially at the Big Ten level, so many of them. And now that they've had a chance to play against other quality opponents in 2022, in 2023 here, you see that jump from year 1 to year 2 in terms of being able to take the next step and not, just essentially playing to your ability. I mean, they have so many guys that you'll see on Saturday, from Jaw Joyner to Danny Strigow to Kyler Baugh, who had 2 sacks the last game, to Jalen Logan Redding, that are now in their second year competing at a Power 5 level. They know what to expect. They're confident in themselves. But I just think that between position coach changes, which I attribute a lot to it, I just don't think that Brick Haley got enough out of what Minnesota was last year. I think Winston through 2 games has gotten more. But this is going to be really a much bigger test than I would say Nebraska was, because you're going to have to get pressure on Drake May. And even within that, you can't allow him to escape the pocket, where you two know he's so good, either with his legs or in that second play in generating explosives with his arm.
Everyone, take a look at Ryan's work at Gopher Illustrated. Some really good stuff, some great insight here, Ryan. We're going to close with one more here. For Minnesota to win this game, what's maybe 2 or 3 things that they need to do very well? I know you probably hit on a couple of them, but you repeat as necessary.
Yeah, I look at this game and Minnesota being a touchdown underdog. I understand it. You're traveling on the road, trying to beat a ranked team. North Carolina has been certainly prolific with their offense. I think they're scoring around 35 points per game their last 16 games here, going back to the start of 2022. And that's the thing to me, is can Joe Rossi slow down Drake May enough? I'm not saying he's got to put the clamps on everything that's going on with that offense, because to me, as much talk as there is around Drake May, that North Carolina rushing attack has been incredible through the first 2 weeks of the season. I mean, we talk about Omarion Hampton. You saw what British Brooks did in week 1 as well. They've been very efficient, very explosive on the ground. But if you can hold this North Carolina offense to 24, 28 points, you're going to give yourself a chance in the fourth quarter. Now, that's obviously easier said than done with what North Carolina has accomplished. But offensively, that's where it's going to come down to for me. Minnesota's offense as well versus that North Carolina defense that just last week gave up 34 points, nearly 500 yards of total offense to App State. Can Minnesota be more explosive? They have 0 explosive passing plays over 25 yards or more. Now, they do have 8 between that 20 to 25 range, but to win on the road against a ranked opponent, you got to be more explosive. And then they got to be a lot better in the red zone. What I mean by that is they've had 8 trips into the red zone their first 2 games. They've only scored a touchdown on 3 of those. And that's where if you're going to be kicking field goals against North Carolina, you ain't going to be able to win this football game. So if Minnesota can be more efficient in the red zone, they're going to give themselves a shot in that fourth quarter to where, I mean, I know that North Carolina was obviously in a very tight game last week, went to overtime in Chapel Hill, but you have to try and slow down Drake May. And that's where you got to change the picture for him, both in your coverages, and Minnesota's defensive line has to get in his face. But it's that fine line of you want to get pressure on him, but you don't want to get out of your lane so that he can extend plays with his legs. I believe the stat is since the start of 2022, he's got 61 first downs with his legs. There's so much talk about him with his arm up here. To me, what scares me about Drake May is if you look at it and he's got 61 first downs with his legs the last 16 games, that's an extra 4 first downs every game just with his legs. If you can just take that in half or just nullify it, I think this game becomes very interesting as we get into the second half.
Definitely very good insight there, and that's something North Carolina fans are used to seeing Drake make those plays, but they're also used to seeing opposing quarterbacks do the exact same thing. Mm-hmm. So I think it will be a battle of that. Ryan Burns, Gopher Illustrated, the message board, the Gopher Report, the joint Tar Pit Premium thread. I think I saw it's on 1,400 responses and 54 pages on the
inside. And it's still going good. We don't have people bickering at one another yet. I'm sure as we get a lot closer to the game and certainly during the game, there'll be some strong opinions and feelings about all things. But I'm just glad that the North Carolina faithful have seen the Minnesota Nice that's going to be traveling down to the Raleigh area here in the next few days.
That is definitely awesome. Maybe not. I was going to say maybe we could do that with every opposing team, but it's just not going to happen.
I like your optimism.
Yeah, right. No chance.
No shot. Ryan, it's always a pleasure to talk to somebody out of the Carolina bubble. I appreciate you taking time to join Greg and I here on the Next Level, on Inside Carolina's Next Level, to talk a little Minnesota, North Carolina football.
Appreciate you guys having me. I'll see you in the press box on Saturday.
All right. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks.